my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. This is going to be my book review or weekly reads, weekly review video for the past 2 weeks. It's only 11 books, but some of them will be a little shorter, and it's still the same length as my other videos because I read a lot less than what I normally would have. We'll get into it. If there's any noise, I apologize. My neighbor is moving out, but I have to record the video now because I'm going to my parents quite soon. The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. I give this 4 stars. A young girl grows up in a southern Mississippi town that has classist elements ingrained into it, racist elements also ingrained in it. Everybody's entrenched in their world viewpoints, and how they negotiate everybody else is very structured into like a patriarchal type hierarchy, essentially. But for our protagonist here, framed as sort of a Nancy Drew type character at the beginning, or at least the marketing jacket would have you believe that, but it's not quite true. Harriet sort of is the quintessential coming-of-age character reimagined. So a classic reimagined might be a good blurb, I guess, for this book, rather than the detective story it really isn't. This has a bunch of different genre tropes converging in a very literary type of sense. So it's very fleshed out. The characterization is very great. The prose work and overall craft work, I would say, in general, is better than The Secret History. And the pivotal sort of inciting incident similar to The Secret History takes place at the very beginning. When Harriet is still a child, she has repressed or blocked memories around this event in which her older brother, Robin, who is still quite young, I think he was only like 12 or 13, something like that, is found dead close to the house, hanged, lynched. And this is a fairly predominant white family, so it's a strange act to be perpetrated on a white character, and clearly sets the stage for the sort of like violence, end of innocence, rejiggering of the personality matrix around a formative event for all of the characters involved in this story. We then do a time jump. Harriet is a little bit older. She wants to be the Nancy Drew type person that she reads about in books, which she mostly relates to rather than people. She has a sort of sidekick guy who helps her out. So in the beginning, you really think it might be like a Scooby-Doo type situation or some of those Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew type books, but it tries on these tropes in the same way that Harriet is trying them on as a child and coming into her own and trying to figure out who she's going to be and trying to really make sense of the adults that she sees around her. She's very precocious. She understands how the world functions more or less, is very like erudite in figuring out how the lens of a particular individual is established and how they function in the world, but not why they have that lens, what occurred, the psychology behind them. She, like most young people, is very like determined, adamant, sees things in only black and white, and wants to have a reckoning with the world and those people in order to change their minds about a particular thing. Generally, there's entrenched worldviews that are antiquated, like racism, that is very predominant throughout it, classism, and unresolved trauma, and specific formative events, though even less traumatic for other characters in the story, have all sort of more or less plotted out their arcs and their trajectory in town, whether or not they're going to leave town or stay, what their job is going to be like, or what have you. And she's very adamant that she's going to be one of the people that is outside of the mold. She's going places. She's going to figure out the death of her brother and all this stuff. But it is, again, a reimagining of a coming-of-age story with some tropes sprinkled in that embodies or exemplifies Harriet's changing state of mind and her adaptation to the people around her. And when there is a reckoning that she so dearly wants, it is so much more realistic and vivid and complex that it just feels a lot more different than the classical style. It sets her up almost as a Mary Sue, but then her reality shifts her into like the complexity and nuance of a young girl who has been disillusioned. So I thought it was fantastic. I give it 4 stars. If you started with this book and then went to The Secret History and The Goldfinch, or anything except The Goldfinch, I think you'll be enamored with the craft work that goes into this if you are into the conceit that the story is peddling. There is no genre expectations being fulfilled, nor is there catharsis or anything like that even remotely on the horizon. But I think that's kind of what makes it special. So next, I consumed We Two Alone, stories by Jack Wang. This I gave 3 stars because it is another type of book where it has an eclectic group of characters, all of them marginalized, all of them experiencing racism, classism, immigration stories, coming together to try to form a sort of like, for me, the expectation is set by the story, so if it lands the expectation, that's merely a 3 for me, even if it is an impressive or ambitious undertaking. So I don't know, for me it was just fine, and again, because of the short story type situation that I always have, some stories are better than others and it drags down some of the better ones. It's just how short stories always tend to go for me. Next, I read Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. This was excellent nonfiction that does what it says it does on the tin. I gave it 4 stars because it exceeded my expectations in so far as like this kind of specificity, even though it is quite short, really did become maybe even unintentionally more intersectional than at least the title suggests. And so I started learning a lot more than I thought I would, even though I had been putting off this book for like 4 or 5 years. I think it came out in 2017 because I had sort of already read on the topic already. So I would say if you already know some of this stuff, but you would like to know how it came about and sort of the intersections of them and why they were constructed in the way that they were intentionally and unintentionally, and the kind of strange things that it affects in the daily lives of marginalized and non-marginalized people, I would definitely give this a ride because it is fascinating, and I think it definitely pertains to the Canadian justice system as well. Justice in quotations. Next, I read Blackwater Rising, J. Porter #1. I did this on audiobook and paperback. This is a murder mystery, dual timelines in which the characters slowly converge into the present. And so that's why it feels meandering, and you have to give it a little bit of time and a little bit of patience in the beginning to see where it is all going, because it feels a lot like characterization purely at the start. But some of the surprising events in the past come to the future, or the present rather. And it becomes like a lot more satisfying to see why J. Porter is the way he is. So because it is a duology, I believe, this does have a lot of setup, but it is definitely standalone. It feels very concerned with issues of racism, of PTSD, trauma, and also a surprising amount of history about the Black Panthers, the way the FBI operated at the time, and sort of how it informed how J. Porter became a PI who gets on this case and what all happens around it. There's crime, corruption. It's very like gritty, but it's not white noir like if you were envisioning Maltese Falcon and stuff like that. Definitely not like that. It has its own thing, maybe sort of like that Blacktop Highway, more Blacktop Highway than Razorblade Tears. I really enjoyed it. I'll definitely go on to the next one, Pleasantville. I wouldn't say the plot is particularly standout. The satisfaction comes from the convergence of the two timelines, which may or may not be played out for you at this point because a lot of stories have been using that device. Next, I read Intimacies by Kitamura. This was a 4-star read. I did it purely on audiobook. It's about an interpreter who ends up kind of having to be placed into a position where she is trying to be objective about a particular case that is raised and that she gets involved with in a man who's like a a political prisoner, who's a tyrant, who's a fascist, but then at a personal level, when she watches the trial, gets to know the lawyer and this particular circumstances, she has to sort of be confronted with notions about justice and about that particular person as a foil to her, essentially. And then there's also a sort of low-key romance thing that is happening that was very much pushed to the side. So it's a very strange book, and I think that strangeness is why it became a 4-star read for me. But I could easily see people being put off by it because it is setting up all these strange expectations with the romance that aren't really met, as well as raising issues on justice and these injustices that occur while not actually saying anything about them in any particular sense as pertaining to the character themselves. Like it's not prescriptive in what you want to get out of it, and it can be seen as maybe not having too much meat on its bones. It's merely concerned with ruminating on these questions rather than even having the character themselves come to a realization of any kind whatsoever, or even a galvanizing moment, really. And there's a lot of B plots that are kind of dropped. So again, yeah, it was a kind of book that subverted my expectations, and I respected it for it. But had somebody said that they really didn't like the book either, I would have understood that too. Next, I read Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Kupersmith. I give this 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. I've been trying to wonder actually what I'm going to say about this book because it's just, it's another subversion of expectations. Very strange, very hard to articulate what the heck happened in this book, really. It's about a young girl, Winnie. She's Vietnamese. She is living in poverty, and really it's about her, as I see it anyway, transgressing into certain situations in order to learn more about herself, as well as being a foil for every character around her to interrogate poverty and classism, while also having a mystical, magical, realist type situation that's occurring throughout it, and only gets more augmented as you read it. All the characters are very well realized. The prose are very interesting in their diction because it feels a lot more like the story is lulling you with a kind of like simple candor, but then gets more intertwined and more confusing. Almost no interaction that I witnessed in this went the way that I expected it to, nor did the ending. And it's that constant being on your toes, trying to figure out what's going on, that made it so compelling. Even though the prose work I wouldn't say was particularly standout, nor is the plot particularly heavy. It is mostly character driven, and it again requires quite a lot of patience for you to roll with it. But because every scene does not go the way that you expect, I think that you'll have no problems rolling with it, because it's just so odd and unique that you want to know what will happen next. At least certainly I did. Next, I read Home Fire by Kamila Shamsie. And this book is so weird for me because it is essentially a nostalgia trip for me. The dynamics between the characters, the conceit of the story, and the overall, not premise, but the specific conceit, I have seen somewhere almost verbatim, and I can't remember where it is or what, and it's kind of driving me insane. I think it's maybe a season of Homeland or the wonderful French show The Bureau. But this is a look at England, a Muslim community / family that is dealing with particular notions around traditional values, as well as ISIS and the perception and racist attitudes of the United Kingdom and really the world at large, Western culture anyway. And when the son of a diplomat is ostensibly seduced by this woman who has a brother who is ostensibly, again, joined ISIS, it sort of is the inciting incident that comes a little bit later in the book that galvanizes all of the different racial undertones and attitudes towards Muslims and the faith, the people of faith, and how they deal with this particular kind of crisis. And then there's sort of the subplot of is she recruiting him or not? Does she love him or not? Is the brother actually a part of ISIS or not? Every aspect of the plot as pertaining to that particular thing I have seen elsewhere, like I said. So it was just a weird experience for me. I gave it 3 stars because technically I think it is fine and works, but nothing about it was surprising, of course, because I knew exactly what was being played out. It didn't feel like any of the characters were particularly that deep, if I'm honest, and it felt like the plot was something that sort of all books that are looking at a Muslim family confronted with sort of radicalism and the attitudes of white people looking at the faith and them being sort of worried that white people are going to think particular things of them and regress in their racial attitudes and be racist towards them because a particular person of faith is acting in a way that isn't in line with their faith, but ends up painting them anyway. So I think maybe this made waves when it came out because it was quite a few years ago, perhaps. For me, it felt pretty bog standard and fine and nothing more. Next is Lit by Mary Karr. This was fantastic. I gave it 4 stars. This is one of those sort of memoirs that are like radical honesty books that I found very endearing. She pulled it off very well. The prose are really great. The structure is fantastic. She knows exactly what is interesting and what isn't, what is thematically appropriate for her through line and what isn't, which is very rare in a memoir, in my opinion. And yeah, it's a spiraling descent, essentially, of her using alcohol to cope for different expectations in her life from her husband, from her family, and just being a woman in general and trying to like do everything as well as have a family, and everyone placing these expectations on her, and then her just sort of, I would say, slow to begin with, but then a rapid descent into alcoholism, and then her dealing with it, and her every day-to-day kind of coping mechanisms to confront that, as well as a more complex look, I think, at alcohol anonymous rhetoric and what it does to confront it. I mean, the whole replacing a higher power or a different addiction for higher power than alcoholism is like sort of done to death, but her thoughts in particular about it, I thought were just very like astute, observant, and drills so much down into the specificity of it that it becomes like a human condition exploration rather than something that could be trite. Next, I finished Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers. I give this 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It did what it said it was on the tin. This is about a woman who is older, not really. She's in her 40s. She's taking care of her mother, and she continues to have to put herself second in her life, or even third or fourth or whatever, and is sort of feeling like she isn't getting the most out of life or even really living life. She's completely devoted to other people that aren't typically devoted back to her. But then a sort of romance appears on her horizon of a kind of messy situation in which her mother's friend's son, I believe it is, sort of makes an appearance, and she, for the first time, is able to express herself, articulate herself to another person, and starts to sort of begin again, maybe, at a later stage in life. But of course, the complexities and the conflict that emerges from that situation of the meddling older mothers, unintentionally and intentionally, make it a lot more difficult than just that. And so it was another thing where I really appreciate it when characters are not bog standard. I really like seeing older people portrayed very well in books, especially if you can pull off the sort of like nuanced and complex thinking processes of an older person without being very like either fetishistic or diminutive typically. And so I really enjoyed the story, but it didn't exceed my expectations. It simply fulfilled what it said it was going to do, and that is completely okay, of course. So I would definitely recommend it, but it didn't blow me away. Next, I read Notes on Grief by Adichie, but this was a BookTube prize book, so I'm not going to talk about it at all. And then I read With My Dog Eyes by Hilda Hilst, which is a very slim member, but has a lot to say. It really packs a punch. There's about 30 pages of introduction, which were actually invaluable, I thought, for once. Most introductions spoil and are typically inane, I find. But this one gives a lot of insight into an author that I was not particularly aware of whatsoever. And why she was sort of like bleeding edge, well-respected, and the themes that were going on. And it really informed my reading. I highly recommend reading the introduction first before consuming it. And then the rest of the 60 pages, I think, of this little book is just the meat of it, the meat on the bone. And it is a man named Amos essentially chronicles his descent into a kind of madness, but more it is about him when confronting himself in a internalized I guess monologue. Like it is sometimes compared, I guess, to Wolf, the introduction guy has said, but it is a lot more candid than that, and intense, dark, and uncensored, I would say. I compared it when talking to Roz Scallydandling about the books. We talked about this a little bit, and I thought it as very like Lynchian. If you've seen Blue Velvet, his earlier stuff in particular, it's very concerned with like presenting a character that's very like dynamic and voicing this sort of disturbing, macabre thoughts that nobody else would, as a way of confronting inner turmoil, the human condition, and juxtaposing, I think anyway, modernity versus and traditional values versus feral, animalistic self of humankind as situated in nature, essentially. And so there's this weird kind of digressions that always take place where the things that he notices, it's definitely like voyeuristic. Like, you don't even get the sense that he would want to articulate these things to the audience, but or to the reader anyway, but it's still something very invaluable in forming what is occurring to this person. He's a mathematician. He's sort of like, the height of intellectualism. He he's a husband, he's a father, but is not satisfied by those things. Like, his dominion is not good enough, essentially. And slowly but surely, what does him in is himself. When he looks into mirrors, when he reflects on certain things, he slowly spirals and is consumed essentially by his animalistic feral side. And eventually his only mark on society is, I think, an equation maybe that he has left behind. I'm not sure if it's published or not, but his only mark in the end seems to be this equation. And so you get the sense that like there's a dark comedy, dark humor at play where Hilda is very critical of men, I think, at least in particular, and the inability for us to see that modernity and society as constructed is not nourishing, and what always ends up winning is our instincts and our primordial self. And so when the end comes, whenever that is and whatever it looks like, we really are not armed and have no armor against that. And so what is the point? And so that it's dark, but I found it very compelling, very interesting. It's poetic. There's actual poetry situated within this sometimes. The diction, I would say, is very like high. The translation must have been very difficult for this person, Adam Morris, who's a PhD. He'd have to be to pull this off, I think. Sometimes there's walls of text, stream of consciousness. There's a ritualistic sense to the rhythm of consuming this book. Like, there's a cadence that continues, and so I think that it's almost like a ritualistic implementation where like his inner thoughts become a ritual for self-sacrifice and self-destruction that continue to grow and subsume him. And so it's a very like compelling read, I thought. I really struggled with it for the first 20 pages, I think. And then once you click with it and you see the repeated thoughts and the patterns and the themes in there, as well as the cadence and the strange word choices sometimes, you really, I think, can't help but notice the craft work that goes into it. So I really enjoyed this, and I gave it 4 stars. And lastly, I consumed They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. This I gave 3 stars. It's a commercial fiction, kind of bog standard book that I just felt in the mood for. It's like popcorn fiction, essentially. It is a good for her or girls who hurt boys who hurt girls story about a professor who's a serial killer on a campus who only targets men who hurt girls, hence the trope. And there's a 2 time period story that's occurring that converges nicely, but the prose are just standard, the characterization is not very deep, and the psychology is not there. However, it is very fun. I liked the ending. It's queer, and I just kind of wanted to be reading guys that were getting got by women after they did shitty things. So it's pretty much the definition of a 3-star read for me. It just exactly what it says it is, no more, and again, completely fine with that. So those are the books that I read in the last 2 weeks. Feel free to comment and have a discussion with me about any of these books. Otherwise, I will see you next week.